Good morning, members. We have a quorum, and it is the appointed time. Let me call the meeting to order. Item number 1, information papers issued since the last meeting. We have not received any items for discussion at the next meeting. There are 3 topics. The next meeting will take place on the 10th of July. It's a Monday. And the meeting times put forward to 8:30. Well, apart from setting up residential care homes for the elderly in Tai Po and Fanling, Elderly Services Program Plan, and welfare support for grassroots facing energy poverty, I would like to add review of child care homes policy. As you all know that, things have happened and there's always been a shortage of beds. So I would like to have a discussion about these 4 topics. If not, well, that will be the items for discussion and also the date of the next meeting. Now we move on to item number 3, transparency of salary and cash allowance for senior management of social welfare organizations. We have received a lot of papers, including those from the administration, and a letter from Dr. Fernando dated the 7th of April. And there's also a study report of Hong Kong CSS. Have you received it? Let me welcome members. We have a Director of Social Welfare, Ms. Carol Yip, and Deputy Director of Social Welfare from the Social Welfare Department, Mr. Lam Ka Tai, and also Assistant Director, Mr. Kwok Chee Leung, and also from the Labour and Welfare Bureau, Principal Assistant Secretary, Mr. Kenneth Chang, and also deputations and individuals. Yes? Well, perhaps that prop can be removed because I can't see the Deputy Chairman. Is there a need to put a prop there? Thank you. Please be seated. There are 12 deputations and individuals. We have 2 hours, so each will have 3 minutes, and afterwards we will have time for members to ask questions and for further discussion. Let me remind individuals and deputations, so you may use the microphone and the earpiece. Floor 0 is floor, 1 is Cantonese, 2 is English, and 3 is Putonghua. And I will ask you to speak in the order of appearance. Each deputations or individuals will have 3 minutes. May I also remind members that what you say will not be protected by the Electoral Powers and Privilege Ordinance Cap 382. The same applies to your submissions. That means you're responsible for what you say. Those who are sitting in a public gallery, you have probably received a notice to persons attending meetings of the LegCo. And if any of you have any submissions, please give the same to us. We will first ask the administration to present the paper, and then I will ask deputations and individuals to speak. Afterwards, I'll ask the administration to reply before I open the floor for members to ask questions. Perhaps I will ask Ms. Carol Yip to present the paper. We have submitted a paper. I have also read the submissions of some individuals and deputations. I think there is a misunderstanding that this is separate from the Social Welfare Department when it comes to payment of remuneration and cash allowance. Let me reiterate that this is a government's arrangement, and in 2003 the administration wing promulgated a set of guidelines to strengthen the control and monitoring of the ranking, structure and remuneration of the top 3 tiers of management in subvented bodies. It also set out the arrangements for public disclosure of the information. It applies to the entire government. That means subvented bodies will have to meet disclosure requirement as per the guidelines in 2003. It's not the case that the SWD changes this arrangement or put in place a separate arrangement. Let me say this. We follow the administration wing's guideline, which stipulates that all subvented bodies which receive subventions of more than 10 million a year, and that accounts for 50% of their operating income, they will have to submit a review report. The SWD will read the review report on the remuneration packages and compare it with that of the last year, and if necessary, we will require explanations and follow up. In 2015-16, 66 organizations must submit their review reports as per the guideline promulgated by the administration wing. And all NGOs receiving lump sum grant subventions must also submit an annual financial report to the SWD. And this has to be promulgated through various channels. First, the Central Administration Unit or Head Office and Notice Board. 2, the NGO's website. 3, the NGO's annual report. 4, through special circulars or newsletters. And I would like to give you some update.
In order to further enhance the transparency and the response to the request made by members on the 22nd of November 2016 at the meeting, several members raised the same request, and after discussion and resolution of the Lump Sum Grant Steering Committee in February 2017, we agree that in stages we would be enhancing the transparency of such reports by the NGOs, and in 3 stages we're going to establish hyperlinks to the NGOs' websites or upload their annual financial reports and review reports onto the SWD's websites. And with the steering committee's agreement, we would be completing that work by the end of June 2017. And as at the 1st of June 2017, among the 165 NGOs receiving LSG subventions, 118 had already provided their hyperlinks or had asked the SWD to upload their reports onto the SWD's website. So this is the latest position. Thank you. Thank you. So let's now invite the deputations and individuals to speak. First, Mr. Chiu-hung from the Civic Party. Thank you, Chairman. I'm from the Civic Party, and my name is Chiu-hung, and I'd like to reflect this to you. That is, within the welfare sector, they are faced with a very serious problem. That is, in terms of remuneration, very often the top tiers will be receiving the biggest share. For example, in 2014-15. If you look at the annual remuneration of some 17 organizations, they are receiving very high pays, and then in 6 organizations, they're also getting the highest pay, and also for 15 organizations, they're also offering some $400,000 in cash to their senior management, and some $2 million have also been given to to many senior management, and that's a very serious problem. And also for those frontline social workers who are working very hard, they are faced with this situation and they are not getting the same pay, even if the job might be similar. And most of them have been recruited on contract terms, and despite the fact that they are doing very much the same job, they are receiving different pay. And there is also no requirement on the part of government to require them to be pegged to social workers working under the SWD. That's why the problem is very serious. The reason why we have this problem, because that there are systemic flaws. That's in terms of the remuneration system. There is no transparency whatsoever under the existing guideline. If the same organization is getting less than $10 million, or if the LSG is accounting for less than half of the total operating cost, it does not have to be accountable to the public with regard to the remuneration system for the senior management. And some 98 organizations, they're actually exempted from disclosing the pay for their senior management, and we are talking about some $2.8 billion in total. So given the lack of transparency, where has the $2.8 billion gone? This is something that would give rise to a lot of suspicion, and also some organizations are also allowed to save up the unused subvention, and that could also account for some 25% of the total funding for them. So some organizations might have deliberately saved up the funding in order to increase the pay for their senior management without really offering services to the community. That's the most worrying part of it. The Civic Party thinks that for the top management of these organizations, they should have spent every dollar and cent on providing services instead of offering handsome payment to the senior management. That's why we should plug the loophole under the existing system in order to enhance the transparency of the remuneration system so as to prevent this from happening. Well, the reason why for more than 10 years now, the administration is fully aware of the problems under the lump sum grant system, and yet nothing has been done to plug the loopholes. And the administration should have enhanced the transparency so that the public will have access to such information. If you do not do anything at all, then the situation will only worsen, and the service providers will be doing this again. Next, the system has been subject to a lot of criticisms for a long time. NGOs would be allowed to give a lot of bonus and allowance to the senior management. All right, they should have existed because they are serving the community, and therefore they should honor their promises instead of giving generous or handsome payment to the senior management, and that has never stopped. How come for many NGOs they are having a lot of surpluses, and yet they are not using such surpluses on the service recipients? Instead, they are just giving a lot of handsome payment to their senior management. So where has the mission gone? So the asset should have belonged to the public, and therefore they should have been accountable to the public. And in terms of the use of public funds, no NGO should be allowed to use that arbitrarily. And if they have not got the funding from the public coffers, then why is it that they would have the money to give such allowances to the senior management? Well, they have raised funds from the public, and has the public given them the right to distribute such bonuses to their senior management? And for every dollar and cent that has been raised with public donations, they should have used it on the public. And they are not really serving the long-term interests of the community. And as parents of the users with regard to the government and also the NGOs use of public funds, I would like to express my regret for that. And I also urge the NGOs to bear in mind why they have existed, and they should not do anything that would cause disgrace to their own institution and the government. And there should also be duty on the part of the government to make sure that such funds would be used properly. And I'd like to refer to the remarks by the Director for Social Welfare, and I'd like to say that I admire what they have done in order to enhance the transparency of the system, but then you have not done enough, and as a result, you have not been able to ensure that they would be using their funds properly, and they have not been subject to the right punishment. All right, you are a parent of a service user. Yes, thank you. Mr. Chang Ching-fat, you're from a trade union. Thank you, Chairman. The subject of today's public hearing is that, well, since year 2000, the lump sum grant system has been introduced by the administration, and that's the root of the problem. And according to the director, well, there is this monitoring system in place. And yet, when you look back, you'll find that the LSG allows the institution to save up to 25% as their reserve. And during the past 10 odd years, there were occasions whereby institutions have saved up to 30% of the total funding. So you're talking about 70% of the funding, and yet they are offering 100% of the services. So this is really ridiculous. And the organization will also be allowed under the guidelines that in operating the services, if they are able to prove that they have spent less than 50% of their services using public funds, then they do not have to be accountable. So the senior management of these organizations could also claim that they are actually wearing different hats, and they would be able to get very handsome allowances and bonuses. And in a moment, I'm sure the other speaker will be giving you more details. And with that incentive, the system is not working at all, because there was once an audit report criticizing these organizations for misusing their funds, and they could even claim that for work injuries, that would also account for some 30% of the use of funding. And we can also give you examples of the senior management of these organizations misusing such funds. And for the person in charge, in order to make up the quota, they would also be prepared to do it at the expense of their staff. And one of which would be the quality of food. And even when we try to increase the food during festivities, they would also charge us, or they would also seek subventions or sponsorships from other organizations. Is it that they don't have enough money to do that? So you may wish to ask them, well, for those organizations under the supervision of the SWD, how many of them have been able to save money? And next is about downsizing the organization, and as a result of that, many frontline workers have been complaining, and there have been many work injuries, and that's also one of the reasons why many have chosen to leave the organizations or their jobs. And also, many organizations are also outsourcing their services, and they will also be running the services with duplication of manpower. That's why, after today's hearing, I think the LegCo should review their system in order to ensure that they would be using their funds properly. And also, what's the role of LegCo? Do you have the powers to find out how they are using their funds? That's one of the questions that I'd like to ask. All right, as to whether or not this council has the power to monitor or find out how they're using their funds, we will have to take another look into this. And after the PAC hearings, we'll be compiling our own report. But then, as to whether or not the Audit Commission has checked their accounts, I'm not sure. And, well, invariably, all the three speakers have spoken on the lump sum grant situation. So may I now call upon the fourth speaker, Mr. Chiu-hung. He's also from one of the trade unions from the welfare sector. Thank you, Chairman. Well, today at the WSP, we are discussing the remuneration system for senior management of welfare organizations. I think this is really very sad, because for welfare organizations and social workers, they should have fought for the well-being of the community, and yet these organizations have become the source of such injustice, and they are actually exploiting their staff. Well, for the LSG system, it has been in place for 17 years, and many organizations have been complaining about the lack of funds. And therefore, as a result of that, they will have to make savings in different areas. And one of the hardest hit would be staff remuneration. But then we have now found out that organization after another have been exploiting their staff, and yet they are actually trying to exploit their staff by reducing their pay, whether or not it's in terms of pay adjustment and so on. Well, very often the organization would be pocketing some of these funds, and invariably we have found out that senior management would be eligible for some big allowances. So with a situation like that, they are actually having a lot of surpluses, and they would only be using the funds to benefit the senior management, and yet they are complaining that they do not have enough funds to run their services. So I think the SWD has an unshakable responsibility to deal with these problems, and yet, as we have seen, the SWD has not adopted effective measures to protect and safeguard the frontline workers so that their pay would not be exploited. And given the huge allowances granted to senior management, obviously there is a problem, and yet the SWD has not been able to come up with effective measures to monitor that. And now all they are saying is that they would be prepared to disclose the reports so that the public can have access to it, and we can also do our part in monitoring what they've been doing. But then does the SWD have a duty to do that? Earlier on, we met with the SWD, and they said that they would be monitoring this very closely, and if the pay adjustment is up to drastically, then they would ask the senior management to explain, and if that has gone up by more than 10%, then the SWD would take corresponding measures. For example, they would ask the senior management to deduct that in the coming year. But then they have also emphasized that they have not got any such precedents, and according to our survey, some 15 organizations, whether it's about their remuneration or allowance system, is very grossly exaggerated or inflated. This is really very problematic, and yet the SWD has not done anything at all. So what has the SWD done? Will they be coming up with measures to monitor such situation? We have to emphasize that what we'd like the SWD to do is to amend the legislation, and there should be requirements for welfare organizations to peg their senior management's pay to that of the government in order to ensure that they would not be overpaid. All right, for the survey that you did earlier on, have you tabled that before us? Would you be tabling that before us so that we can take a look? Yes, it's okay. Actually, we have filed complaints with the Complaints Division, and we have already furnished the information to you, and we can also furnish the information to the WSP.
Ms. Suki Choi, I'm very glad to see the director here and also representative of the Hong Kong CSS. So I would like to hear some answers. Previously, there was a survey done by the cable TV covering how many NGOs senior managements have received big remunerations in 2015-16. I heard that it was about 20. However, the Hong Kong CSS report said that there are only 9. So where has the 11 gone? Fallen through into a black hole? I see that they have only surveyed 85 organizations, so only half of the previous survey. This shows that their survey is quite incomprehensive. They haven't covered all organizations. Hong Kong CSS is representative of these organizations. How can they think they can be accountable by giving us this report? Journalists are able to find more information, so perhaps the Hong Kong CSS can tell us what has happened. And I would like to also talk about the amount. Hong Kong CSS said that on average is about 44,000. This is rather strange. because previously there was a report from the staff of NGOs, and it was uncovered that for organizations like Pull & Cook, they have received a large amount of remunerations. Say, for example, 2015-16, 640,000. So how come that the Hong Kong CSS can only work out an average of 40,000? This really is not an average. I don't understand. Transparency. The Hong Kong CSS report covers 85 organizations with an average of $40,000. So I do cast doubt on this report. Well, instead of getting themselves misunderstood and wasting their time on this incomplete report, well, I reckon that the SWD has received all the information. Perhaps the information can be completely disclosed instead of asking the Hong Kong CSS to do this hard work of coming up with an incomplete report. They receive public money as well. It won't be good if they attract suspicion because of a poor report. The Hong Kong CSS has said that because of increased workload and responsibility amongst the senior echelon. But you can see that for frontline staff, their workload has increased as well. And once every 1 or 2 years, there will be another review on the remuneration of frontline staff. Perhaps they can publish the report as well, so that we know the difference between the remuneration of frontline colleagues and also the senior management, because we don't want to misunderstand you. The Hong Kong CSS is here, so we would like to hear from them something that is fair and reasonable. Well, let me remind you that this is a public hearing, so if you want to ask questions, or if the party you are talking to is actually the administration. But I do believe that you have all received the Hong Kong CSS report. Next, Mr. Dou Zhenhou is from the CTU. Well, we have been criticizing the LSG. It's been implemented for 17 years, but we found that people working for the same job will receive different remuneration. We received information from the SWD that for 2014-15, the highest accumulated reserve stands at $3.19 billion. So there has been an increase of 200 million a year. And in the 2014-15 year, out of 164 subvented organizations, well, 82, just half, exactly half of these organizations have a reserve of over 25%. And 22 of them have over 51% as well. Well, as you can see, that what we ask for is better remuneration for everyone. Well, how come that, well, for some of them, they receive a lot more in their maximum point than others? Shouldn't an NGO work for the poor instead of trying to fatten those who already have got a lot? The focus of this issue should not just stay on criticizing some of them for fattening themselves up. Well, the administration has used a lot of rhetoric to dress up this LSD. The so-called flexibility and autonomy is the autonomy and flexibility of senior management, not frontline staff. And the efficiency improved is not the delivery of a service. We see that there has been a high turnover of frontline staff, which is not conducive to social welfare stability. Well, I do think that the abuse of excessive remuneration given to senior management is only one symptom of the overall ailment of the LSG. Well, at that time, it was Mrs. Carrie Lam who was the director for social welfare, and that was also Lord Chiu-hung, who was also an advocate of the LSG. Now that Mrs. Carrie Lam is going to be the chief executive, and Mr. Lord Chiu-hung's rumored to be the next Secretary for Labour and Welfare. I hope that there will be a complete overhaul. Under the LSG manual, paragraph 4.4G, the role of the Director for Social Welfare include to stop or suspend LSG if organizations fail to abide by the rules. So I would like to ask Ms. Yip. So now some organizations have been disclosed to issue excessive remuneration to senior management. Will the SWD deduct the subvention as a penalty? Well, if not, then there is dereliction of duty. People will think that you're colluding with these organizations. Please answer me. Next is Mr. Cliff Choi. Perhaps we will hear from Mr. Chua Hoi Wai first, Hong Kong CSS. Well, we asked the Human Resources Association to conduct a study to help the public and legislators understand about the subvention given to subvented organizations. There are 85 NGOs that have participated in this survey. They receive the subvented amount received account for 75% of their overall subvention. They have given us a set of PowerPoint with over 40 slides. The full report will be available later, and as soon as we've received it, we will forward it to the LegCo. And we've also prepared a 5-page summary. I will defer to my colleague, Mr. Cliff Choi, to go over the report. Well, this survey is on the remuneration, actual remuneration of the senior management of NGOs. There is cash and non-cash remuneration. We show the actual overall remuneration and not individual components. And we also look at organizations of different sizes. For small organizations, that is with an annual expenditure under 20 million, the overall median of management is about $710,000. So compared to SWO median of 850,000 is a lot lower. Well, and about for medium organizations with an expenditure of 20 million to 100 million dollars, that was 970,000. Compared to SSWO, a median of $606 million is a lot. $1.66 million, so it's a lot lower. We see that for large organizations, that is with an expenditure of over $100 million, we see that the median is $1.35 million compared to CSWO, a median of $1.27 million. We also see that it is lower, which is similar to someone who is responsible for 24 classes. 40% of these organizations have an expenditure of about $100 million to $300 million. 30% of them are over $500 million. So we also look at the different teams with different expertise responsible for planning and liaison with different sectors. Well, we can see that their remuneration is lower than their counterparts in the private sector or in the government. Let me move on to the subsidy, the allowance. We were able to carve out the allowance from their basic salary to use as incentives, but it is not prevalent. Say, for example, cash allowance for performance 11%, medical 6%, and end of contract about 5%. For cash and non-cash allowance, it accounts for less than 3%. So counting the 9% of MPF, we see that this accounts for only 12% of the overall remuneration. Compared to senior management, 24% is only half. And this is the policy. This is a policy of the organizations and not for individuals. And for other rankings, there are also similar policies. This is my report. Thank you. Next, let's hear from Mr. Eric Chen. We are a concerned group of social welfare. We've been following the lump sum grant system, subvention, and also the remuneration. We would like to condemn the LWB and also the SWD for the dereliction of duty and misconduct, because when it comes to each payment of remuneration and cash allowance, well, Ms. Carol Yip, under Public Finance Ordinance, the control officer of Head 170, I do believe that she has violated a regulation because she did it without the consent of the financial secretary. Well, there is actually in the lump sum grant manual, in the guideline promulgated in 2003 October, it says that the remuneration of NGOs should not be higher than their counterparts in the civil service. Well, however, this part has disappeared in the lump sum grant manual published in May 2012. Our concern group has asked the SWD, which gave us an ambiguous answer. We see on the website of the SWD that this lump sum grant menu 2000 has disappeared. We can only see the 2012 and also the October 2016 version. Our concern group would like to hear from the Social Welfare Department. How come that this principle has disappeared?
And after it has disappeared, the problem that we are facing today arose. Then second point is that starting from the 1st of January 2008, the SWD, without any consultation or review, at the time we had an independent review committee on the lump sum grant system, and the well-established and long-standing arrangement for deploying representatives attending the board of directors and also the management committee of these subvented bodies was scrapped. And it was done with private notice, and the reason was that they would like to respect the subvented bodies' principles of governance, and without proper governance and supervision by the SWD, they could do whatever they want, and that was the reason why we have seen the worsening of the problem. And recently, the concerned group received a letter from the Bureau saying that, well, after the implementation of the LSG system, these subvented organizations have been given more autonomy. Well, we try to check with the laws and manuals. Well, we don't see that these NGOs have been given more autonomy. And if that can be established, then it means that the NGOs are now distributing bonuses and allowances, and that's under their own autonomy, and there is nothing that this council or the administration could do. So I think the Bureau or the department have sent out a wrong message, and the whole thing is wrong. So the concerned group would like to look at the legislation, and we will be going after the problem under the law. So we'd like to make the following request. First, under the current lump sum grant menu, the addition 2 of the menu, that is, their pay should not be higher than their counterparts within the civil service. I think that should be inserted once again. Without that, next time, by enhancing the transparency, what you would be telling people is that they will be getting even higher cash allowances. So that's totally meaningless. You will have to do it again. You will have to insert that principle in the menu so that in signing the agreement with the NGOs on the lump sum grant system, I think they have to respect this, and therefore when the SWD goes to these NGOs to talk about the agreements, they will have to abide by the terms of the menu. Second, Mr. Chen, you have already overrun by 2 minutes. You will have to grasp your time better, because this is a very important subject. It has to do with public interest. And secondly, the SWD should have set this up in the lump sum grant menu. They should have worked with the ICAC to take a look at the operation of these NGOs, and if they notice that they have abused the system, then the ICAC should be asked to conduct investigations. And third, we'd like to ask the panel to write to the Audit Commission so that they can conduct value for money audit checks, so that they'll be able to find out whether or not the senior management of these NGOs are working so hard that they deserve such high cash allowances. And the SWD should have chosen some 10 typical organizations so that they would be subject to members' questions and so on. Sorry, you have already overrun on your time. You have already given us your submission, and I'm sure that's already adequate. And if we have more time, then you can have a second chance to speak. Okay, before we end, several questions have raised questions pointing to the SWD, and some of them are very serious allegations. They are pointing out that you have misconducted yourself. So do you need to clarify that? So first, Director, please respond to that first, and then the floor will be open to members. Okay, so Director. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, deputations, for giving us your views. And I'm grateful to the speakers just now who have confirmed or actually expressed admiration to the SWD for enhancing the transparency of these NGOs, because that's been done in response to members and the community's request that transparency should be enhanced. I'd like to clarify several points or elucidate on what I've just said. Well, one of the issues raised was that under the lump sum grant system, there were several problems. But then, as I said at the beginning, I've already made it clear that concerning the remuneration system's transparency, well, that's the overall arrangement of the government. So it's not something that is unique under the lump sum grant system. That's why in different areas, well, for subvented organizations which are receiving government funding, then in response to the guidelines issued by the administration wing in year 2003, they have to follow the guidelines. As to the queries that, well, under our own guideline, we have amended some of the clauses. Well, let me once again clarify that we have not done it on our own. For example, for the principle that their remuneration should not be better than that of their counterparts in the civil service, that's not done by the SWD alone. In fact, we have followed the administration's wing's guideline issued in year 2003, which applies to all subvented organizations. Under this guideline, it says that if the operating income has received less than 50% from the administration, or if the subvention is no more than $10 million, then they will be exempted. So concerning the subvented organizations in the welfare sector, we all have to abide by this principle. In terms of the arrangements, I understand that this council has already written to the administration wing, and we have already been discussing with the administration wing, and that dialogue will continue. But I have to emphasize here, this is not something that has been done by the SWD on its own. It applies to all subvented organizations in Hong Kong. So I hope that this will serve to clarify the situation here once and for all. Next, I would like to explain further. That is under the guideline issued by the administration wing in 2003. We have actually put in place a number of measures. For example, every year for all the subvented organizations by the end of October, they are required to submit an assessment report to confirm whether or not they are required to submit the review report. And for those getting $10 million or more, or over 50% of their operating expenditure comes from the government, then they will have to submit a report concerning the top 3 tiers staff of their organization. They will also have to compare what changes have taken place, and they will have to explain or justify those changes. And upon receipt of such reports, we also have to consider a number of factors, and those were also queries raised by a number of speakers just now. What we would be considering would be whether the NGO's management and also the areas of services and also the types of services and also the scale of operation of the NGO concerned. As you have said, different NGOs are operating under different scales, and therefore the management would be responsible for different areas of management, and that's very important. And we have also considered how they should be compared to similar posts in the civil service. And if we notice that, for example, for a particular year, if the pay adjustment has been very substantial, which might have departed from their counterparts in the civil service for the top 3 tiers of the management, then we would take follow-up action. For example, you asked whether actions have been taken. Indeed, we have taken such actions. We would ask the NGO to explain, and when necessary, we would also interview the board of directors of the NGO and also the relevant management committees of that NGO. And concerning these reports, we have taken follow-up actions accordingly. Looking forward, and I hope that you have also confirmed just now that in this regard, well, we have heard from the HKCSS, which has conducted an objective survey, and they have also got some data from that survey. We hope that from the SWD's perspective and also from the welfare sector's perspective, once again, we should enhance the transparency even further. That's why in year 2014, I was very pleased to have reached a consensus with the representative from the sector. That is that we would be implementing this good practice guideline, and under that guideline, staff's remuneration package is not something that we have been able to reach a consensus with all the sectors concerned. So we will continue to work on that direction, because at the committee we have management's representatives and staff size representatives and also users representatives, as well as some independents. So in this regard, we hope that we can reach a consensus so that we can further enhance the transparency. Moving on, can you give me a bit more time, because I hope that members would also understand that better. Concerning the issue raised by the speakers with regard to allowances being given to the management of the NGOs, we've been following up on each and every case. So I'd like to explain a bit about the principles that we go by. That is for allowances granted to the senior management. Well, that's part and parcel of their pay package. In some organizations, well, they would increase the allowances instead of increasing their pay. And according to some NGOs, well, some allowances would apply to all eligible staff. For example, according to some NGOs, they would be issuing shift allowance for night shifts. So all eligible staff would be able to get that allowance, and other allowances include housing allowances, transportation allowances, or even hard work pay and outstanding performance allowance and so on. So they would be looking at their own human resource policy and also the agreement that they've reached with their own staff. And according to some NGOs concerning these allowances, they have also resorted to different channels so that their staff would understand them properly. For example, staff meetings and also notices, news bulletins and intranet of their own organization, or even in the contracts with the staff, they have already informed their staff of this arrangement. So through this, I hope that we'll be able to allay some of your concerns and worries, but then we will continue to talk to the organizations, and according to some organizations, well, for these allowances that would be granted to their senior management, they have all discussed that at the board of directors and they have been approved by the board accordingly. With regard to how this will be dealt with, well, some speakers have expressed different concerns just now, but then as I've just said, starting from 2014, we have implemented the best practices guideline. We asked the board of different NGOs to discuss that at least once a year on how they should be using their own reserve, and they should also be announcing as to how their reserve has been used every year and in the future how they plan to use that reserve. So that has given rise to some concerns, and at the steering committee we'll be looking into this and we will continue to discuss it. Several representatives also talk about the guidelines or menu, and they ask whether or not that can be reduced to NGOs receiving less than $10 million. Well, we have to act in accordance with the guidelines in requiring them to disclose their review report, or whether or not the 50% threshold can be changed. Well, as I said, this council has already started a discussion with the administration wing, and we have also been discussing with the administration wing. According to our understanding, well, the reason why these two principles have been set, that's in line with the government's overall policy to balance the public's right to know and the NGO's autonomy. So that we'll be looking at a particular NGO where the funding mainly comes from the government. So only in those cases would we be imposing this requirement on them. As for those receiving less than $10 million funding from the government's view is that, well, given the limited funding or subvention, or because of the small scale of operation of these NGOs, and if they are subject to such monitoring, then it's not very cost effective. So we do understand that, well, the LegCo will be discussing with the administration wing as well as the SWD. So these are the arrangements that I'd like to explain, and I hope that you can note that. Yes,
there are still some questions unanswered, including the administration wing's guideline 2003. Someone mentioned about remuneration no higher than their counterparts in the civil service. Is it the case that it's been taken away? There is also someone who mentioned about attendance of SWD in board meetings. Does it mean that it doesn't happen anymore? So can you maybe give us brief answers, or perhaps shall we hear from members first? Let me first explain about no higher than civil service paid. It was in 2003. There was regulation, and actually strengthened regulation of the top 3 levels, and we require the review report. So we have dispensed with this rule. That is, recruitment at terms are not more favorable than the counterparts in the civil service, because we don't want to micromanage subvented organizations. When the guideline was endorsed in 2003, there was already strengthening in the supervision and monitoring of the top 3 levels of NGOs. So in 2003, we have done away with this principle of no more favorable than their counterparts in the civil service, and we have amended all the relevant guidelines in the government. But this is the order: Fernando Chiu-hung, Kokaki, Lau Siu Lai, Junius Ho, Regina Ip. First, let's hear from Dr. Fernando Chiu-hung, 5 minutes, question and answers included. Thank you. And I thank you all for coming to talk to us about transparency of remuneration of senior management of social welfare organizations. In the past, there has been incidents uncovered involving senior management of NGOs receiving a huge remuneration. Public money given out should be spent on where it is needed, that is, on grassroots and those in need. That means that the subvention should go to help the underprivileged instead of allowing organizations to hoard it. When public money is dispensed, it should be used on members of the public instead of allowing these organizations to save a quarter of it and then use financial tricks to fatten themselves. What we can see today is that when organizations think that they have saved enough, say they have reached the ceiling of 25%, we see some organizations having to cough up the excessive amount because they have been saving too much. That extra amount can be spent on staff, as bonus is very dangerous. The Hong Kong CSS said that on average is $40,000, but staff think differently. I'm talking about not the figure, but the system. Say, a unit that provides elderly service, they require 10 people, but currently they only employed 8. At the end of the year, if that unit can give all the information to the SWD and hasn't done anything wrong, then the remuneration that are supposed to go to the 2 members of staff can be distributed amongst the 8 people. Of course, if you're a supervisor, you will receive more. That under the current system is allowed because it is the money they have saved, and it goes towards their reserve and it can be split up. This is really scary because this system undermines the soundness of social welfare service provision. Don't tell me about overtime or some other systems to muddy the water. I'm talking about a bonus sharing system similar to the private sector. There are 165 subvented organizations. How many of them have this bonus sharing system in place? Let's hear from the director. There are 2 parts. First, reserve, and the relations between the allowance. As I've explained, different organizations have their own remuneration policy in relation to issuance of allowance. It may not be done from the reserve. From the information we have collected from organizations in the past 5 years, the level of reserve remains more or less the same. So I would like to dispel your concern here. I do agree that reserve should be used on provision of service or on staff training or remuneration, and we have been liaising with organizations about this. Well, these are non-profit making organizations, so there is no such concept as profit sharing. We see that there are about 20 organizations that issue cash allowance to these most senior management. We have been following up with these 20 organizations. They've explained to us that is related to the remuneration or human resources policy of the organization. There are criteria and formula set down in the issuance of remuneration. It's not the case that the senior management decide to pay themselves extra. Everything has to be discussed and endorsed in the relevant committees. This may be in place of a salary increase. Different organizations may have different arrangements, but we have told them that these arrangements will have to be disclosed to their staff members. We've urged them to make better use of their reserve. And we've also urged them to enhance their transparency. Okay, then I have one thing to ask. I asked the SWD to give us information paper setting out the actual amount distributed. You don't call them sharing of profit or bonus. You call them allowance. Then I ask you that amongst the 20 organizations, what are the criteria and how much was distributed? Yes, as I said that we've been asking the sector to enhance transparency. Exactly. Yes, I will follow it up with the organizations and give you the information. Thank you. Next, Dr. Kokaki. Thank you. I thank the deputations and individuals to come to us. I find it outrageous. Well, the director treats it as a business. The lump sum grant can be saved up. Frontline staff are exploited. And then the money is used to generate interest, and in the end, the extra is distributed. I thought that it's a private company, but we're talking about social welfare organizations. We keep hearing about frontline officers being exploited. They can't even get a salary that's like mod 1. Some of them are employed on a contract basis. Some of these beneficiaries treat the organizations as partners so that they can make money together. I think this lump sum grant subvention system has distorted the system. If you receive public money, even just 1 cent, you will have to disclose the use. Well, it talked about 50%. More 50% of operating income and $10 million, year 2003. I think it's very easy. You give me 200 million, then I will find $201 million outside, so that I don't have to be monitored by you. We're talking about social welfare organizations helping grassroots and underprivileged. How come there is money left? How come the money is not used to help those who are in most need? Why would there be a sharing of bonus? If the same applies to the government, then people will be able to get a share of the reserve of the government. You treat it as a profitable business, but this is a social welfare organization. Nowadays, for social welfare organizations, especially for big ones, they run the organization like a business. They don't treat the target groups or their staff members as one of their own. They just want to make a lot more money for themselves. And the government has the cheek to explain for them. The lump sum grant hurt the social welfare sector. It should be cancelled. And I would like to ask about the administration wing's guideline. $10 million and 50%, it has to be changed. There should not be any threshold unless these organizations don't receive any public money. This is an unreasonable threshold and it should be taken away. All subvented organizations should submit their financial report and remuneration information of the 3 top tiers. Dr. Kwok's questions are very clear. The standards set down in the 2003 administration guideline, can you do more than that? We have explained this is not just a guideline that applies to the social welfare sector. It's for all subvented organizations of the government. Well, actually, discussions in the LegCo have already started. There are other subvented organizations not from the social welfare sector. They are also subject to the same guidelines. But as I've said, that discussion about this have already started. Dr. Kwok's been talking about running it as a business. As I said, that this doesn't happen. It's just that you don't see it. I don't want to waste my time. I do understand that this doesn't just apply to social welfare sector. Yes, all subvented organizations should have the same standard. You are the director of the SWD. You should ask the administration or the government to change it. Can you give us this promise? I say it once again, this applies to all subvented organizations. It covers the entire government. I can't say that, well, the SWD is not going to abide by it. But I will undertake that I will discuss it with the administration wing. So you will give us a promise that as director of the SWD, you will do it for the social welfare sector. As I've said, it applies to all subvented organizations covering the entire government. I can't say that I am the SWD and we will not abide by it. But I will promise that I will continue discussion with them. And the discussion with the administration wing, with the SWD and the LegCo have started.
And indeed, we have already started the discussion with the administration wing, and I've already explained some of the considerations that are related to this matter. Lau Siu Lai, well, Chairman, actually, from what I've heard, I am really very angry about this, because I couldn't understand that the administration has been giving a lot of funding to the NGOs, and yet there has not been enough food for the elderly people receiving the services. So because under the LSG, the organizations are actually saving up the money, and as a result of that, they have too much reserve, and they have to distribute bonuses and incentive payments to the senior management. So this is happening in all quarters of our community, and the elderly is suffering. So according to the frontline workers, they are telling us what is happening on the ground. So according to some organizations, they are telling us that, for the different organizations, because of their different structure and the amount of money that is in their hands is different. That's why they will have to pay their staff differently. I think this is most unreasonable, because let me draw this or make this analogy. All right, I'm teaching at an institution, and for every semester I might be teaching 600 students, and some other teachers are teaching only 20 students. Does that mean that I should be receiving a higher pay? No, of course not. So I can reduce the number of administration hours, and then I would be focusing on my teaching, and then there would be other different levels of staff who would also be working on different areas. So does that mean that the management would be managing all these different areas? They would hire or recruit more assistants, so that so why is it that for an organization that is larger, they would be eligible for more pay? I think that's unreasonable. So different organizations should have greater mobility, and there should also be a promotion ladder for their staff to climb up. Instead, you're suggesting that the senior management would be eligible for higher pay. Well, actually, I've also attended a class strike, and I heard one of the management staff saying that, well, he found out that in Hong Kong, we have this special phenomenon, that is the top management of NGOs are receiving a lot of pay. But then, and then he asked if the social workers are also receiving very high pay, and how can you have empathy for those receiving your services? And he's of the view that social workers should, and also their supervisors should not receiving very high pay. I'm not asking you to lower your pay or get a pay cut, but then you should at least make sure that within the same sector, well, in terms of the hierarchy, there should be upward mobility so that staff would have better morale. How come they are saving money, and as a result, the elderly who is receiving food from them would be getting less food? Well, at the SWD, as an individual government department, could not have put in place a different arrangement from other departments. But then you should have reflected that to the administration wing. These are subvented bodies, and they should be having a similar organization structure, so that for grassroots workers, they should have upward mobility, and their remuneration should be properly protected, so that would attract staff to stay in the organization. Because when we say that the elders should be able to stay in the community, but what happens if the frontline workers are not able to serve them? So you will have to ensure that for the frontline workers, they will have a chance to move up, and their pay would also be reasonable, so that we'll be able to take good care of those service recipients. So I hope that the SWD can do your best, and you should reflect your views to the administration wing, so that our service users will be able to get proper care. Any response? Well, concerning the guidelines, I've already repeatedly explained that, and the Council will also be discussing that with the administration wing. As to the comments made by members, we would also be conveying that to the administration wing. Ms. Lau also referred to the quality of service. I'd like to clarify once again that for all the subvented services, we would always sign an agreement with the relevant NGOs. And for the subventions that we have given to them, they would be used on the services. We have set out that when they receive subventions from the government, they will have to provide a certain quality of service. So there is no question that because they'd like to make savings and put that into their reserve, they would cut back on their services. So I'd like to clarify that they will have to separate the accounts. And also on the concern expressed on the LSG system, I'd like to clarify that over the years we have been keeping an eye on this, and in 2008, actually we conducted an independent review, which is a very comprehensive one, and we have also looked at over 100 NGOs, and we have also organized some sharing sessions, and 130 submissions were received. And at the time, the consensus that we reached was that through the LSG, NGOs in providing the services would be more flexible, and they are also able to improve the services more flexibly. And for the service users, their satisfaction has improved, and they can also get more diversified services. So I'd like to reiterate that no system is perfect or flaw-free. But then Under the current system, in the past, we have conducted a very large-scale review, and in terms of the service quality and also the satisfaction of service users and the types of service that they can enjoy, that has improved, and the service has also been enhanced. But then, as some speakers have said, we've been keeping this under review, and we have never ceased to further enhance the transparency of operation of the NGOs. And in 2014, we already reached an agreement at the four-party committee so that we would introduce this best practice guideline. And today, when I look back, yes, there is further room for enhancing that transparency of the sector. That is for the staff remuneration policy and also the organization structure of the NGO. If we are able to further enhance that transparency, then I think in terms of the overall governance of the sector, and that would also help dispel a lot of skepticism or suspicion on the part of the community. So we will continue to do that. Well, it's not that there is no improvement, but then in terms of the pace of such improvement, it's been at snail's pace. Well, in 2008, well, there were over 3,000 social workers taking on strike, and then in 2008 something also happened, and then in 2014 you introduced the best practice guideline, and still you haven't implemented all the recommendations. So it shows that some progress has been made, but then, as you can imagine, the pace has been pretty slow. Well, Chairman, I'd just like to make a few remarks. Well, I agree with the director that, well, it's more flexible, but then it doesn't mean that it's good. All right, in 2001, you've managed to introduce that, and then you said that, well, these users are more happy, but then it doesn't mean that they have spent more on the users, and that has led to the improvement of the service quality. I can see that the social workers are complaining, and their pay has not been adjusted, and the service has not been adequate, and therefore we have to look at the inadequacy of the existing services. But then I'm also very pleased that you are prepared to review. But then, as the chairman just said, the pace has been very slow. I hope that the service users can be properly taken care of instead of just giving us these slogans and so on. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask the director that in 2013 you said that you already improve the transparency by enhancing the transparency of the senior management of these NGOs, and it's not 2013, it's 2003 instead. So for staff remuneration, you said that the transparency would be enhanced so that there would be posts and uploading of the reports onto the website and so on and so forth. Well, over the years, you have done so much, and according to you, have you been able to do what has been suggested by Mr. Choi Hoi-wei? That is for the top 3 tiers of the senior management of these NGOs. Would you be looking at their pay levels? Because since 2003, we've been very concerned that you might be fattening the senior management of these NGOs, but not the lower levels of these NGOs, and some might not have followed the guidelines, and yet there are others who have been following your guidelines. And according to Mr. Choi's report, well, for the senior management, they would that would depend on the scale of the organizations. Even for smaller scale organizations, the average pay is only $60,000 a month. So you're talking about a mean value of about $700,000 a year. And then for medium sized, you're just talking about some $80,000 a month. And then even for large scale or large organizations, you're talking about $1 million a year. So in table 2 of the report, what is your view on this? So have we been overpaying them, or are we underpaying them? I think sometimes you have to pay them handsomely so that they would their integrity could be better safeguarded. But then how can you balance between the two? So from this report, what I've seen is that apparently we are not really overpaying them. But then according to some speakers, well, there might be a dozen or so who might have abused the system, and if they are doing this, then will there be any sanction against them if they are not following your guidelines? Director, Mr. Ho was referring to the HKCSS survey, we are looking at the top 3 tiers of their management. And as I just said, when we receive the review reports from the institutions, well, we have also done our own work. We try to compare that with the comparative posts within the civil service. We agree that they are more or less in line with the remuneration for a similar post in the civil service. All right, for a particular year, the allowances might be on the high side, but then we will have to look at the pay policy of that organization. If indeed incentive pay has become part and parcel of their pay package, and so long as they are more or less in line with their counterparts in the civil service, then that's okay. But then from what I've heard from the deputations, other than the fact that they are concerned that the senior management would be getting too much, well, they are actually concerned that for the lower levels, in particular those working at the front line, they are more concerned about their pay. And that would also go back to the remuneration system of the organization. And in some cases, they might have signed contracts with their staff. And as I've said, that's the autonomy of those organizations. And the management committee of the NGOs themselves should also come up with the relevant pay policy. I've heard from members that they'd like the administration to set the pay policy for these NGOs. Well, in this regard, we also have to be very clear about this. That is, we do offer them subventions. But then at the same time, under the current monitoring mechanism, we also have to strike a balance between what we do and what they are able to do. And also for introduction of new services. Well, starting from February this year, we have actually moved forward for any new service introduced. So before we approve any subvention, the overall manpower establishment, that is from the top to the bottom, we have already given them clearer guidelines. Yes, I'd like to clarify for the senior management, well, if they have exceeded the standards, if they have acted against addition to of the LSG menu, then how many cases are there? And if there are such cases, how are you going to rectify that? Well, as I explained, the situation is more or less in line, and one or two might be problematic, and we've already talked to their board of directors. But then overall speaking, I'm sure the HKCSS survey was also an objective survey, and overall system, their pay is in line with their counterparts in the civil service. But then from what we have heard from the sector, they are alleging that the senior management would be receiving the lion's share of the subvention. But then apparently, according to the SWT, that's not the case, and they have already looked at over 100 such NGOs. So I'd like to know whether or not the gap between the senior management and the lower level would be too great. And of course, the administration is saying that that's under the autonomy of the NGOs, and the administration doesn't want to interfere. But then if they have already breached Section A of the guideline, all right, the director said that she had identified one or two such cases. We will have to face up to these problems squarely. And how are you going to rectify the problem? And can you make sure that they would be brought in line with the overall situation? So do you have a timetable for rectifying the situation? We have already followed up with the relevant institution. We have already talked to the board of directors to ask them to conduct a review.
I think the situation will improve. Can you reply to Mr. Ho's point? The two organizations that you have followed up on, they have adjusted downwards the salary, or that you've told them not to do it the next year? They will review the system for the next year, and we will follow it up next year. Mrs. Regina Ip, to be followed by Mr. Leung Yu-chung. Thank you. I have a question to ask. The guideline 2003 of the administration wing, covering all subvented organizations, which includes universities, self-financed universities, the hospital authority, Trade Development Council, Productivity Council, etc. It covers all subvented organizations, is that right? Well, as far as I understand, the universities are exempted. Some organizations are exempted for various reasons. I want to know about the coverage. Universities have their own arrangements, so universities are exempted. So how common is it? What other organizations are exempted? There are some organizations that are exempted. I will give you the information later. Well, you use the word guidelines, but under guidelines there is discretion to be exercised by directors, and you don't have any. I don't believe it. We have discussed with the administration wing. They say that they will leave it to the Bureau for implementation of the guidelines, so we will have to follow the Bureau's direction. Well, you have discretion. You can't just blame it on the 2003 guideline. You should ask for review. Especially if the guideline covers many different things and it may not be suitable for social welfare sector. And I have read the report of the Hong Kong CSS and the Human Resources Association. I think when it comes to assessment of the remuneration, they follow practice in the private sector. Say, for example, expenditure and also number of staff. But social welfare organization is different. They handle different matters. And the parties to receive assistance are different. So there may be a need for a different set of assessment. The general principle of the guidelines, say for example, public subvention under 50% of the operating cost, or subvention under $10 million, they will be exempted. I don't see any discretion, but I will discuss with the administration wing. Well, I mean, your bureau is the implementer, and it should constantly review the guideline. And you may also talk to subvented organizations whether to follow the indicators in the private sector. There may be new indicators proposed. Thank you. We have taken that into consideration with our discussion with subvented organizations. Perhaps you can go back, think about it, and come back with some proposals. Well, first, you need to show us the 2003 guideline, and a number of members have asked you to talk to the administration wing, and Mrs. Regina would like to know what you will say or what you would have said to the administration. So the current indicators are expenditure and also level of staff. But that's different if you are a social welfare organization. Some organizations may provide a special service to grassroots, so there may be a different set of indicators. In 2003, in relation to the administration wing guideline, well, actually a legal brief has been given to the LegCo. It explains about the exemption criteria and the number of principles that members have talked about. I think we can give it to the LegCo for your reference. Well, we have to follow the guidelines, but when it comes to implementing the guideline by individual organizations, we have been discussing with these organizations about their own policies. Small organizations that encounter difficulties will be followed up by us. We will see which organizations would like to get more help from us. Next, Mr. Leung Yiu-chung. Afterward is Dr. Pierre Chen and the Deputy Chairman. Well, I don't really understand the remuneration and its operation in NGOs, but from what I've heard, that there is this situation when the senior management receive much more. The director said that according to a survey, the remuneration is actually comparable to the counterparts in the civil service. I'm a teacher. I know about the situation of teachers. Of course, for teachers, it's school-based. There is a sum given to schools to use. But the remuneration of principals and teachers are well established and transparent. I think that's the best way, because it won't give rise to doubts and arguments. Well, you said, well, for us, you said we will talk to the school board, and the school board will talk to the government, and then in the end it will just follow the government's rules. Then how come you don't adopt what other members have suggested? Come up with a separate mechanism. Then you don't have to spend time to talk to them, to conduct survey. Ask the Education Bureau. There's one thing they don't have to do. They don't have to talk to principals and school boards to find out how much teachers are earning, so they can focus on what they need to do. It will be simple and it will be more effective. It's done for schools. Why can't you do it? Well, I'm sure that the director will answer you that there is autonomy. Well, Education Bureau also says that schools have autonomy. They have autonomy, but it's just that when it comes to remuneration, they don't. Well, schools engage teaching assistants, but there is no remuneration structure, so they are paid pittance. They receive a salary of just over $10,000, but they do a lot of things, and that is because there is no established remuneration mechanism, and it's for the school to decide. That's why it is so unfair. How come? Well, if you are a teacher, you have a degree, then you know how much you will be receiving. Director, I think it's back to the subvention system of the social welfare sector. Flexibility is given to organizations to decide on management and remuneration. In a review report in 2006, it shows that if an organization cannot engage someone they will be able to engage someone else to provide the service. I can't say that we would like to have autonomy and flexibility. Sorry, but I would like to explain. These factors are conflicting. Can't say that, there is flexibility for organizations to set remuneration packages with its staff, and at the same time government will set down the remuneration structure. This runs counter to the subvention system of the social welfare sector. We need to go back to find a system where there is flexibility, and at the same time the government will make decisions for them. We will have to think whether it is feasible. Mr. Leung, I'm not saying that the system for subvented school is very good, but there is a merit. They have flexibility, they provide services to students and teachers. It works in schools. I don't understand why you say that there is no flexibility. Well, as I've told you, that I oppose to recruiting TAs at such a low salary level, but they have flexibility. I don't want to waste too much of my time. I have been talking about this point for many years. Can you give us a report? How come it works in subvented schools but can't in the social welfare sector? You can criticize the system, but you need to explain why you say that it is a lack of flexibility. What you said does not run counter to school-based principle. Schools have autonomy, and they still have flexibility. They have a sum of money to engage professionals or teaching assistants. How come it doesn't work in the social welfare sector? Director, would you be able to give us the information paper? Chairman, you've been working in the social welfare sector. I am not from the education sector. But if you compare the two sectors, the social welfare sector has been responding to public aspiration to diversify. In the past few years, we've launched a number of pilot schemes to change the form, the mode of operation, and the type of service. We have never stopped responding to public aspirations asking for change. So those who work in social welfare sector would understand that we have to be swift to change. Well, as I said just now, that we have best practice, and we'll be able to forge consensus in this steering committee.
We will continue to work hard to do that, and as I've just said, after many years of discussion, for any new service to be introduced in terms of the manpower arrangement, that will be disclosed on our website, and we're talking about over 100 different services. We're talking about some template of manpower establishment. All these would also be uploaded onto the website of the SWD. We've been working very hard on this, and we hope that the NGOs will make reference to that if they're going to introduce a particular type of service as to what's the manpower level like. They can also make reference to our website. So we have already disclosed all the details on our website. Well, Chairman, if you want me to make a comparison between welfare services and education, my personal view is as what I've said. And I'm sure, Chairman, you're also from the welfare sector, and I'm sure you would understand that the nature of these would be different. The reason why we have been referring back to the 2003 guideline, because for the education sector, they have their own independent monitoring mechanism, and so we should not be comparing two systems which are very different in nature. Okay, so after the two members have spoken, I'll give the time for the deputations to respond. But then please grasp the time. First, Dr. Chen Puyin. Thank you, Chairman. I don't exactly agree that NGOs' autonomy and flexibility should be used as a shield or an excuse for preventing government intervention, because we're talking about the use of public funds and whether or not such funds will be able to go to the hands of the service recipients and also the staff. And in different areas, we can see that for the administration cost and also administrative staff, they are actually taking up a lion's share of the funding. That's what we're talking about. And today's discussion is not an attempt to restrict the ability of the NGOs to recruit people. We are also not trying to tie their hands when it comes to their autonomy. We're just talking about enhancing transparency so that they would disclose more information to the public. So, for example, their annual financial report and also their annual report, they should be disclosed to the public. And if you are prepared to upload those reports onto your website, then the public will be able to access such information, and then you would be more disciplined in using the funds. And every year when the government offers subventions to these NGOs, well, in giving them the funds, you should have the responsibility as well as the right to check their accounts. It's like this council approving funds to the administration. We also have the duty to check how you're using the funds. All right, you have the guidelines, and very often we talk about the guidelines. And in para 4 of your paper, you said that they are required to submit information or annual financial reports on the remuneration for the top 3 tiers of their organization. You can require them to submit reports to you, but then not all NGOs are required to do so. But then for the frontline staff, if they breach the guidelines, they know the consequence. But then what if the NGOs do not follow your guidelines? So during the past 5 years, for NGOs that have flouted your requirement, have there been any sanctions or punishments on these NGOs? That's the question that I'd like to ask. And last but not least, I'm concerned because, as you can see, the current trend is that once particular services have been outsourced to these non-profit making organizations, well, the phenomenon will only continue or expand in the next term of government. And if you do not enhance the transparency, the situation would only get worse, because the funds might not be able to go into the hands of those in need. So have you ever punished any NGOs who have flouted your rules? Well, I have to emphasize that the rules do not apply to all the NGOs. Not all the NGOs are required to disclose the details of the remuneration for the top 3 tiers of their management. So all NGOs have followed the guidelines, as I've said. Well, in October every year, they have to submit a report on their self-assessment, and according to the guideline, they would also have to submit that review report. So all NGOs do follow that practice. As to how we're going to further enhance the transparency or for overall supervision, that would help. And other than myself, the SWD also agrees with that. And in the past, in different areas, we've been working very closely with the sector in order to enhance the transparency. We fully share that view. But then I don't quite understand it. Can I ask some follow-up questions? Because in para 6 of the paper, in your last paragraph, you said that as at the 1st of June 2017, amongst the 165 NGOs receiving LSG subventions, well, there were only 38 review reports that are disclosed through this arrangement. So what happens to the others? So after a lot of hard work, only 38 review reports have been disclosed through this arrangement. What about the remaining ones? So when will they be complying with your conditions by disclosing their reports through their websites? Well, in para 6, well, we are talking about one further step that has gone beyond the LSG menu, because our requirement is that the NGOs will have to disclose the details in through different channels. They can disclose that on their website or through other notifications or news bulletins and so on. But then after discussing with this panel and also discussing with the steering committee, we would like to do or take one step further. That is for the review report and also the annual financial reports, we'd like them to be uploaded onto the SWD's website, so that would form a one-stop service, so that there can be hyperlinks, so that there can be one-stop disclosure of such information. Whoever is interested in getting the information, they do not have to go to the website of the NGOs. They can just come to our website. They can either find those reports on our website, or there would be hyperlinks on our website, so that they can get connected to the relevant reports. So that would be completed by the end of June. There wouldn't be problems in downloading the reports. Is it read-only, or would that allow for downloading? Yes, that would allow for downloading. Yes, Deputy Chairman, Mr. Kong Cho-yu. Well, I'm also a registered social worker. And I understand that, well, on day one, our teacher would tell us what social worker is. So you'll be able to make ends meet, you'll be able to make a living, but then you will not be able to get rich. So you will have to really very sincere and dedicated to your job. And therefore, honestly, for raw social workers joining the profession, they don't really mind if their pay would not be very high. But then, if the problem has not been identified by the media, then we would not have known it. So it's not that the NGO does not have money. They are actually flooded with surplus, and yet for the staff working at the front line, they are not getting what the NGO has got. And in some cases, they're actually getting an incentive payment of over $2 million, which will be much higher than their counterparts in the civil service. So how come for management staff who are getting overpaid, and then at the same time for the social workers working on the front line, they're actually faced with this uneven distribution of resources? Well, you might say that that's something which is internal to the NGO. But then, before the media uncover the problems, were you aware of that? For example, just one management individual might be getting over $2 million in terms of allowance and so on. So, well, before this was identified or uncovered, so you do have the responsibility to ensure that the funds have been used properly. And if you can do a bit more, if you can create this atmosphere so that the NGOs would be made aware of that, that is, if they were to offer the best level of services to the community, then they would have to ensure that those working at the front line would be properly paid. All right, you say that the NGOs would have autonomy, and as a result of that, they would be more prepared to provide diversified services to the community. Sorry, that's not the case. In fact, you should have helped those working at the front line, or else you won't be able to provide diversified, quality services to the community. In fact, the social workers are not really too mindful of whether or not they get high pays. It's just that they are not happy if it's unjust. So you will have to review the situation, and you will also have to introduce measures to immediately improve the situation. As I've just said, so were that the Women's Federation of China, and what if they get overpaid? So what will happen next year? Will there be a refunding mechanism? So would they be required to refund the government or reimburse the government for what they have misused? Director, with regard to the remuneration system of the NGOs, do we know that? Well, as I've explained, we have been following up on those cases so that for the top 3 tiers of the organization, they will require to submit a report, and we will make comparison with the civil service remuneration mechanism. So we will try to compare them with the comparative posts in the civil service. And also if there are changes, for example, if in a particular year they have increased the pay very substantially, then we would follow up. So we've been liaising closely with the organization or even their board of directors very closely. But then, as I said, all in all, well, for the top 3 tiers of these organizations which are required to submit review reports, well, we have found out that their remuneration is in line with their counterparts in the civil service. So we would be reviewing that very closely. We'll be looking at all the reports that have been submitted to us. Well, you also refer to the remuneration package for the frontline social workers. Yes, we do understand that we have talked to different friends on different occasions. We agree that these NGOs should treat their frontline staff well, and throughout the subvention system, that's the spirit. And under the subvention system, we say that in determining the funding level at the mid-range salary, that's the spirit. That is when they apply to recruit more staff, well, there is this entry pay, but then we have decided that well, they would be given this midpoint pay, so that in recruiting any staff member, then they would be able to make sure that they have enough money to pay their staff, because as soon as a new recruit joins in an organization, we would be prepared to pay him the midpoint salary. So, well, we fully agree that they should treat their staff well, and that's something that we have been talking to the NGOs, and we will continue with that. Okay, by 11:35 we will have to start a new discussion on a new topic. So just 1 minute from the deputations, please. So can you indicate which one of you would like to speak? All of you would like to speak? Just 1 minute, please, because we will overrun on our schedule. Because after you have spoken, the administration or the SWD would also like to respond. Okay, so I'll have to draw a line at 1 minute. Yes, Mr. McChicken, you don't have anything to add? Yes. First of all, I'd like to emphasize one thing. That is, the LSG is not something between the staff and the organization. What about the service users? Because I've not heard you say that the interests of the service users would be affected. So I'd like you to know that service users would be affected by this. Second, well, for the subventions given to the organizations, that would give rise to some problems. One, responsibility or duties. And that would include the service offered to the service users and also the support given to the frontline staff. So it's not that so long as they have autonomy, they can do whatever they want. Because under the LSG system, apparently, they don't need to take up any responsibility at all. And for some NGOs, well, the way they pay their staff, they would use allowance to take the place of a pay cut. And that's not what we want to see. Yes, Mr. Cheng? Yes. I'd like to say this to the department. That is for the service agreement between the SWD and the NGO. That's a service agreement. But then have you ever looked at it? That is over 25 of the NGOs. What's the survey like for the service satisfaction? It's about the NGOs and also the wastage rate for staff in these NGOs. And for those with some 25% reserve, have you looked at the top 3 tiers of their management? What's their pay like?
I think it's the role to be played by the Social Welfare Department in this regard. Next, Mr. Yao. Well, to be blunt, I think the director was pretending to be ignorant. She thanked the Hong Kong CSS for giving the information, but I don't think that is the case. Obviously, there is a loophole. I don't think the SWD could get the information. But it says that for exemptions, if it is, well, if more than 50% of operating income comes from sources other than the funding, and also subvention under $10 million, there will be an exemption. And I think that there will be more than 66 organizations. I do see that for some organizations, public money accounts for over 50% of the operating income. Say Tonghua Groups of Hospitals in 2015-16, out of the $4.4 billion, $2.69 billion came from public money. So this organization is exempted from having to disclose the remuneration of the senior management. We do ask the SWD and the administration wing to plug this loophole. Well, just now the SWDC said that you will be able to download the information, but I do think that there are some that you will not be able to download the information. That is Sun Yi Hui. And on top of that, you said that there was a no non-compliance. But according to a report, it says that there are still 2 organizations that have failed the compliance. And just now it was said that the senior management receive a remuneration comparable to civil servants. So, can you tell me the difference between the civil servants and our frontline staff? The Hong Kong CSS questionnaire is returned on a voluntary basis. So how can this be objective? And there is another word that is quite grating to my ears: follow up. Well, for those organizations that receive more than the counterparts in the civil service, would you ask them to cough the money, to cough up the money and give it back, or just going to talk to them? So how outrageous should an organization be before you actually ask them to do something? Hong Kong CSS. Well, our survey is not that complete because we only had a very short time, and not many organizations participated. We would like more to participate. We found that senior management don't receive a high remuneration, lower than the SWD counterparts. Dr. Fernando talked about recruiting 8 people instead of 10 so that the extra money could be distributed. Well, I say that there is no such system in place. Say, for example, before LSG, well, there are about 30,000 people, but now 60,000. So over a period of 15 years, the number of the manpower level has increased by 100%. Previously, there weren't too many people staying in the residential care home for elderly people suffering from dementia or who are mobility impaired. So more people actually have been recruited. It's not the case that fewer people are recruited so that more money can be distributed. Mr. Yip. Well, we have used the survey to provide objective information for members and the public's reference. There has been a lot of people who have spoken about the remuneration of frontline staff, service quality. Hong Kong CSS fully agree with that. Frontline officers are very important, and the voice of service users should be listened to improve our quality of service. We hope to use the review of the lump sum grant to listen to different views to improve our service. Mr. Chan, Eric. We ask for the version 2002.14, no more favorable than counterparts in civil servants be reinstated. I also ask the Social Welfare Department Director to send a representative of each NGO. Well, to send representatives of the department to the board meetings of each NGO. Well, what about disclosing the information of the lowest three tier of the organization at the same time? Then you know how much the poorest is receiving. Well, I see that the highest remuneration is over $1 million, when at the same time the lowest salary is $9,000. Well, when it comes to social welfare organization, we talk about equality and equity. So how come someone's receiving only $9,000? You're talking about social workers? Well, let me give you more information. Sorry, just yes or no. So $1 million is the technical staff. Thank you. I'll have to start the next item. Ms. Lau Xiaolai would like to say something and Dr. Fernando Cheung would like to reply. You only have 1 minute. Other members, would you like to reply using 1 minute? Now I only see 2. Ms. Lau Xiaolai. Just a quick remark. I identify with what Mr. Eric Chan said. Yes. Elementary levels remuneration should be disclosed, because it's a very serious problem that they're having, that the senior management received most of the money. That's why people don't want to join. And on a number of occasions, well, Mr. Cha just give the floor to his colleague when it comes to detailed information, and it shows that the senior echelon will delegate, so the workload is not that heavy. Don't say that it's a big organization and I'm high up, so I need more salary. That is not the case, and it's fully illustrated just now. Dr. Fernando Cheung, I do have to reply to it. Well, this public offer of $3 billion, where does it come from? Because they have recruited fewer people and paid them less. Where does the money come from? It's from public money to provide service to members of the public. And instead of doing that, they hoard it. Is it because they deliver less service? No. They provide 100 or 200 of the service capacity. At the same time, they are able to save up a quarter of the money. Where does the money come from? Because they employ less people. When there is more service demand, you need more people. You cut manpower, you cut pay to save the 2.5, currently $3 billion of hard-earned money. And this should be used on service users. And everything stemmed from this lump sum grant. This is the root of all evil. And you even told me that there is no bonus sharing. Let's hear from the director. You only have 3 minutes. Let me say it again. We agree that the pay structure, pay level should be fair and open. Just now, someone mentioned about disclosing the remuneration of frontline officers. We will discuss it further. We have already started discussion in the steering committee in this regard. As I said, that in the best practice, when it comes to staff remuneration, is one of the areas that we have not agreed on, and we'll continue to work on it. There are some suggestions to improving the guideline and to include the principle of no more favorable than pay no more favorable than counterparts in the civil service. As I've said, that we have started discussion with the administration wing. And well, when it comes to further enhancing the transparency, is something that we will do. In relation to uploading the information, someone said that they can't download the information. I've just tried it and I can do it. We have tried to download all information uploaded onto the internet. Well, perhaps we will try to find out what happened. If we find that there is any deviation, we don't just chat with the management. We will indeed review it with the board. Well, if there is a major change in remuneration, it has to be covered by a consent of the board. We follow it up with the board, and for these cases, they will be reviewed by the board as well. And as to under what circumstance when subvention is cut. I remember in some previous meeting, there has been a case in the social welfare sector. The organization performed poorly in management, so subvention was terminated. There will be a discussion in the steering committee of the lump sum grant, and we will talk about how to follow up on the individual cases. We have different representatives, including service users, in the steering committee, so that we will be able to follow it up from different perspectives. We have overrun by 10 minutes. So the item ends here. I thank the administration for coming. Well, you promised us some reports and information paper. Please do it. Next, well, I also thank the 12 individuals and organizations. Next, review of effectiveness of low-income working family allowance scheme. You may raise your hand if you want to speak. There is also one motion from Mr. Michael Tian. If other members have a motion to move, please prepare it. I apologize, we have overrun for 10 minutes. We have from the Labor and Welfare Bureau, Mr. Chan and his team. I'll ask Mr. Chan Brian to take us through the paper. Well, as we've said that in a year's time after the implementation of the low-income working family allowance scheme, we will conduct a review. It's been 1 year, so I will talk to you about our review preparation work.
Well, the upcoming review will be comprehensive, including the effectiveness of LIFA in helping the working poor, and also with regard to the pattern of their work, will there be any impact? And also when compared to other subvention programs, what's the interaction between them, and also with regard to the income limit and also the asset limit, and also on the working hours limitation, and so on and so forth. So we will be taking a fresh look at that, and we'll be listening to you. So it's going to be a comprehensive policy review. And despite the fact that we have only started that for 1 year, and we're going to start the review shortly, we have been listening to you, including the views submitted by other organizations. To summarize, there are two mainstream opinions. That is, there are eligible applicants, and some of them have not come forward to apply for it. So we will make reference to your views. And also, you have also conducted some surveys, and we will also be doing our own surveys in order to find out why they have not applied for it. And also, in terms of the number of applications, and one thing that is not really related to this, that is about whether we should relax the eligibility criteria, because many think that well, the income level might be too high, because many people might be working fewer working hours, and yet their pay might be higher, and they should still be eligible. Well, in terms of that, that would also be taken on board. So we are collecting the information that we need in conducting the review. That is about the administration figures, and also the questionnaire on families receiving the LIVA. And also, we will also try to get out of information that cannot be obtained through the survey. And the Census and Statistics Department is going to do the general household survey this year, and they would also be including certain questions. That is, there are certain households who should have been eligible, and yet they are not applying for this allowance. And as we have said, we have been taking on board views submitted by the stakeholders and so on, and some have made suggestions on the application procedures, some have made suggestions on the eligibility criteria and so on, and we will consider them very carefully, and we will continue to maintain a dialogue with the stakeholders to collect their views and feedback on the design and implementation of the scheme. Thank you. Okay, so we'd like to find out more from you first. All right, a year ago when you introduced the scheme, you said that some 250,000 households would be eligible. So you're talking about some 700,000, and now you only have a small percentage coming forward. So there is this discrepancy between what you expected and what happened on the ground. So who would be held responsible? And where is the problem? So why do we have this situation? Well, Chairman, initially, when we did the projection, it was just a projection. So it's not a target. We did not say that definitely some 200,000 people would be applying. So we said that on the face of it, there were about 200,000 people who should be eligible. But then we did not have all the information. We just had the income information and also working hours information. But then we did not have the information about their assets level. And also there might be different situations concerning the households, and that would also not be reflected in the income level. For example, for some people, when they have to submit their applications, they might have encountered some difficulties, or there might be other reasons for them not to apply for it. So these would be found out through our discussions with the stakeholders and also through our survey. But then, Mr. Chen, yes, I understand that that's your target, okay, 200,000 households. But then at present, some 32,000 households are actually applying. So there is a huge discrepancy. This is far from satisfactory. And also, a second quick question. Okay, who would be responsible for this scheme? Which institution will be responsible for conducting the survey? Well, the government will be conducting this review on its own. And of course, we have the Bureau, and also we have the office, that is the WFAO, the Working Family Allowance Office. And we also have the Census and Statistics Department, the CNS Department, helping us. We hope that by the end of this year, we will be able to come up with some further recommendations. A couple of days ago, well, I was with Ms. Chung attending some review sessions with some stakeholders. I think the outcome was quite positive. So I think we should grasp the opportunity. we should seize the opportunity to talk to the users. Yes, Chairman, that is noted. Indeed, from the start of the scheme, either the Bureau or the Bureau together with the WFAO have been meeting with these groups. In fact, during the past 12 months or so, we have met already 11 or 12 times. Next, the floor is open to members. Mr. Leung Yiu-chung, Leung Chi-cheung, they have both indicated that they'd like to speak. All right, Mr. Chung Chiu-hung too. Okay. Mr. Leung Yiu-chung, 4 minutes first. All right, thank you, Chairman. Well, I don't know if the Bureau would come forward to say that it's a total failure for the scheme. If you look at the review, well, only some 30,000 families have come forward. So it's less than 1/4 of the expected number of families who would be expected to apply. I think this is really very horrible. Because if you have less than 1/5 of the families coming forward, then how can you call it a success? I think it's a total failure. And in fact, you have also explained why it has failed. There are 3 main reasons. First, the procedures are far too complicated. Well, according to some stakeholders, well, they've already filled out the form, and even if they have submitted the form, they would just withdraw their application. They would not press ahead with their application because when they attempted to fill out the forms, even if our colleagues try to help them to fill the forms, it would take us a lot of time. And even after they have submitted the forms, you would give them calls to ask them for further information, and it would be very difficult for them to get certain information from their employers, because you will have to understand that most of the applicants would be casual workers and they have different employers, and if they have to accumulate enough number of working hours, then they would have to go after different employers for the information. And some employers would be reluctant to fill out the forms. Yes, you have the forms, and then you have been giving calls to the workers, and they rather not return the forms to you. So that's the biggest problem. That is the cumbersome procedures. Second, concerning wages and also working hours, that's where the problem lies. Well, when Matthew Cheung used to be the bureau director, well, he said that if you work harder, then you would be getting more. But then, okay, so they've accumulated enough working hours. But then it doesn't necessarily mean that they would get more, because their pay or wages would have exceeded the income limit. So for those with longer working hours, they would not be able to get it. But then for those getting lower pay, all right, they have not worked enough hours, and therefore they would also not be eligible. So this conflict would be the crux of the matter. And if you do not resolve this problem, then you would not be able to do anything to improve the scheme. And also for singleton families, you said that they have to have families. And for singleton household, you do not treat that as a family. All right, for children, they are part of the family. Yes, you can take them into account, okay? So if they have children, they would be counted as part of the family. How come you do not call one-person family a household? I would find it strange. If it's not a family, then what would they be? How can you call that? How can you not call that a household? So is it that if I'm single, I'm not entitled to having a family? So you should relax that on this occasion, so that one-person family would also be eligible. I think that's the overriding principle. You should have considered it. Next, in a community, there are criticisms that you've been operating behind closed doors is a black box operation. You're not prepared to disclose everything to the public. Is that the case? So you're dragging your feet. So you have not submitted the report to us. And if it's not a black box operation, then through what channels are you going to take on board our views expressed in the community so that there can be public discussions? All right, there are several points. First, about the administrative procedures. Okay, I'll be asking the director to supplement, but then I'd like to say a few words on this. Well, we'll be reviewing that too. On this occasion, we'll be reviewing the administrative procedures, but then whenever there are schemes like that being rolled out, inevitably we have to strike a balance between facilitating the applications and the need to safeguard the proper use of public funds. Then definitely we have to impose certain requirements. And if you think that there are too many things in the forms and there are certain problems or questions that we should not have asked, so that they should not be required to fill out those details, then yes, we will be prepared to consider it, and that will be included in the review. And the third point that Mr. Leung just referred to is about working hours, whether that should be relaxed, and also the wage limit. Well, that would be looked at in this review too. But then I'd like to reiterate that is the consideration on whether or not we should relax the rule on working hours and also on wage limit. Okay, if you look at the number of participants, it's not going to be a big problem for them. Well, even though there might be a lot of people who have taken part, but then if the working hours would be such that we should also help those with lower wages and lower working or fewer working hours, then we would be prepared to look into that. And then for one-person families, initially when we introduced the scheme, after all, this is a new scheme. In particular, when we have working hours and also if you have children, the amount would also not be low. That's why we have to be very careful. And initially, in our consideration for one person or 1P family, they are eligible for Social Security, and they would also be eligible for the transport allowance subsidy scheme. That's why they have been excluded initially. But then on this occasion, we'll look into that. And by the end of this year, we'd like to come up with recommendations. And during the interim, we'll be more than happy to talk to the stakeholders, and the suggestions that they have made during the past year would also be taken on board. Well, downstairs there were also demonstrators submitting petitions. So taking care of children, would that be counted as working hours? Because in some families they have children. And at present, well, for these families, is it okay if you do not pack your allowance with the working hours? Mr. Leung, according to some applicants, well, for the transportation allowance, is a lot more simple. It's not like this. So can you align the scheme with that one? Okay, I'll defer to the SWD. In coming up with the application forms, we have also made reference to the arrangements under the transportation allowance scheme. With regard to casual workers, with regard to the work record claim form, well, we have also made reference to the transportation allowance scheme, because in the end, they would also have to submit certain information about their work so that we have an idea as to whether they are eligible for the scheme. Because on working hours, the requirement, well, that's very much the spirit of the scheme. That's why, from our perspective, we do need to know that. We do need to scrutinize that to find out if they are eligible. And then basically, when they try to fill out the form on the first occasion, because they are not familiar with the forms, and they do not know exactly what are required of them, and whether they have difficulties requiring assistance and so on. But then on the second or third occasion, we noticed that the applicants basically understand what they would be required to fill in, and then when we ask them for further supplementary information, they would have no difficulty at all in furnishing further details. That's why when we attempt to help certain applicants to make their first application, we would try to find out what they do not understand about the forms, and then basically that would help. Okay, so for the simplified form, how many pages are there? 6 pages. 6 pages at present. I think there are questions which are difficult to answer, because according to some residents, they will have to do it several times. They will have to submit it, and they will have to refurnish further information. So I'd like to know on how many cases do you have to ask the applicants to submit further information, because according to some residents, they said that they would have to do it time and again. So how many times do they have to furnish further details? Well, that depends on the case. In some cases, they might have a contract saying that they would be required to work for certain hours a month, then that would be more simple. But then in some cases, the information that they furnish might not have been comprehensive, and on those occasions, we will have to talk to them again.
I would like to say that we have case conference that takes place once every 2 weeks. I chair it. This is a platform to deal with more complicated cases. I will be able to give direct instruction to deal with these cases. Next, Mr. Leung Chiu-hung. Thank you. This is rather disappointing. The idea itself is good to give some assistance to families with a low income. People don't apply. Eligible applicants don't apply because it's quite troublesome. They only get several $100s, but they have to go through what's practically an interrogation. They don't feel any respect, so they rather not apply for it. I think that's one of the reasons. Information about number of working hours and proof. A lot of employers find it quite troublesome because they have to provide separate proof. Would it be changed to something similar to the elderly living allowance? Proof will only be required when your case is selected for inspection. You'll get into trouble if your case is selected for inspection and you can't provide information or you provide false information. This will simplify the procedure. If people are asked to provide information as if they are going through an inspection, it will be very difficult. The amount of the allowance is 600 or 300. Should it be reviewed? 300 is just $10 a day. It makes no difference. People will simply spend $10 less a day. Well, I can't call you stingy because it's an assistance. But the amount is so small that it will be not of much help. There is no incentive for them to apply. The recent Gini coefficients released, well, I do think that without the subsidy scheme, the Gini coefficient should be would have been higher. It's now higher than 4. It's still quite alarming. I do think that you need more people to apply for this scheme. Well, so first is about the control, inspection, and the amount. Mr. Donald Chen. Well, the monetary amount is also under the scope of our review. We will also consider whether there should be an automatic adjustment mechanism. At the start, we should be careful, because we don't know what impact it will have on the labor market. If the amount is too high, then employers may pay people less. So we would only change the amount when it's supported by data. The application procedure, perhaps I will defer to Mr. Lee. It's slightly different from the OALA, the old age living allowance. If we don't check at the time of the application but only afterwards, then it will be difficult and it will be troublesome for the applicant if it is found that well, he worked less than he claimed, and some money will have to be deducted from the amount dispensed. Applicants are required to make an application once every 6 months. If there are no documentations provided by the employer to prove number of working hours, then the applicant may use the pro forma in the application form. This has struck a balance between trouble caused to employers and audit requirement. If we just do it based on a trust system without verifying the information, and if we identify problems afterwards, then we will have to ask for the money back, and we will need to consider whether there is fraud involved, and it's something that we don't want to see. Thank you. Next, Mr. Poon Siu Ping. Thank you. The chairman has asked a lot of questions we have on our mind. The policy intent is to encourage low-income families to be self-reliant through employment with a focus on supporting families and youth and children to ease intergenerational poverty. The actual number of applications is a lot lower, as at 2nd of June there are 74,000 applications with over 55,000 applications approved, involving about 119,000 people, that is 52,000 children or youths. So about 20,000 cases not accounted for here. Are they rejected or being processed? Well, you have to go through a lot of hurdles. You have to prove your hours of work. You have to go through means test. Well, I remember that a lot of posts have been added to the Working Family and Student Financial Assistance Agency to deal with this. Well, now that the workload is smaller, will the manpower be able to meet demand? Between the 1st of January to the 15th of May 2017, NGOs were commissioned to provide form filling support service for new applicants. Well, there are about 380 new applications received. How many NGOs were engaged? Are there resources given to these NGOs? You said that at the end of 2017, hopefully there will be improvement measures proposed. At the end of June, there will be questionnaire or survey. And in middle of June, the Census and Statistics Department will complete their survey. How much time will the administration need? Would it take as long as 6-7 months? Can it be expedited so that improvement measures can be put in place to benefit more people earlier? Perhaps I will answer the last question. I'll defer the other questions to the head. At the end of July, they will finish with the field work and they will have to analyze the data. On top of that, we have to we have to take into account views of stakeholders, financial implications, and going through internal procedures. We hope that we'll be able to come up with suggestions before the end of the year. I'll now defer to the head for the other parts. Before that, I would like to ask, well, when it comes to the abolition of the absence rule, it was done very swiftly. Yes, we have included in review number of hours and income and asset limit. Absence rule is not an important part of the design. That's why it was done very quickly. We now have a 0.539. So how can you put in place measures to help? Well, if we conduct a review in 1 year's time and come up with suggestions in 6 months' time, it's already very fast. We have received about 74,000 applications with 55,900 or so applications being approved. As at 2nd of June, there are 4,181 applications rejected because of exceedance in the income limit, asset limit, failure to meet the number of working hours, and previously there was also the absence rule. In some cases, supplementary information was not supplied, so 4,181 rejected cases. We continue to deal with the other applications. Starting from May, we accept a third batch of applications. So our work is being continued. Between January and May, we have asked NGOs to help us to provide form filling service. There are 4 NGOs. There's a network all over the territory to provide the form filling service. We've received 380 applications. Manpower. We have about close to 500 people. When we launched the scheme, we received resources to set up the agency. Previously, because of the low number of applications, we have deployed resources to do more field work. Every day we will go to the Lok Fu Center to provide advisory service and assistance. It's very well received. This is we provide a service at the same locations as application for PRH units. So the target group are more or less the same. So every day we receive inquiries. We also take turns to government office buildings. So for people who go to government offices, they will see us and they may ask questions. If we receive requests to provide briefing sessions or assistance, we will do so. Some of the assistance required may be done outside office hours, say after work, Saturdays and Sundays. Mr. Poon asked some detailed questions that are quite interesting. The 4 NGOs. Any additional expenditure that has to be covered. And you have reserved you thought that there will be 200,000 people. You have asked for more people. So now 32,000 with 500 people dealing with these cases.
So you've done more outreaching work and so on. All right, that's because of the discrepancy between your expectation and the actual outturn. So you recruited 500 people to process the applications because you expected some 200,000 households to come forward, and in the end you only had 32,000, and still you have 500 people processing their applications. Okay, Mr. Kwong. Well, the administration introduced this WIFA, and initially they expected some 500,000 people to benefit, and now only about 110,000 people benefited. They come from some 30,000 families or households. So what's your assessment of the success or otherwise of the scheme? Is it successful or is it a failure? And what are the reasons? Well, Chairman, let me explain. Initially, we had this projection because when you ask for funding or resources and when you need to redeploy your staff, we need to make a projection on the number of applications. So this is not the target. This has never been the target. It's just our projection. And of course, there is this discrepancy that the outturn might not have been as expected. And that's the reason why we have to conduct a review now. We have to find out the reasons. That would also include the conducting of surveys so that we'll find out why the eligible families did not apply for it. Well, earlier on, I also went to the district to contact the grassroots families in Tien Shui Wai. I asked them why they did not apply for LIFA. And the husband was working in the construction site, and he's a casual worker, and it would be difficult for him to meet your requirements. And according to some residents, well, when the wife asked the husband to apply for it, he would be required to submit further information time and again, and also on the working hours is rather stringent. And as a result of that, even if those factors have been taken out, these families would be excluded. And there is also a saying, because when I contacted these families, they said that for the life, there is also this children allowance. So you will have to meet that requirement first. So they will have to meet that requirement on children before they would be eligible. And according to my contact, yes, many of them would wish to get that because they would find it extremely difficult. And then from the government's perspective, well, of course, I hope that you can reach your target because many people have been saying that the Gini coefficient has been so high that you will have to do something about it. So how can you meet the initial target of having 200,000 households benefiting from this? So on working hours, would you relax the restriction? And second, would you be further publicizing it so that more people will find it easier to fill out the forms? Because according to my understanding, the forms would be extremely difficult to fill out. Well, Mr. Chen, well, as I said, there are two aspects. Those who on prima facie study would be eligible and yet they do not come forward to apply. And second, why many families are not eligible. Well, many have told us that because of the application procedures which have deterred them from applying. Well, any scheme will have to take into account the proper use of public funds, and we will have to strike a balance. If we do not require them to furnish any information, that would also not be right. But then, of course, we have to try to simplify it, and indeed that has been done. Well, for the 6-page form, well, if you do not have the third or fourth member in your family, then you do not have to fill out certain parts of the form. So those would be optional. And also, well, for those who are not able to meet the working hours requirement, that is, they are working less than 144 hours, or they have not met the threshold of 50 or 60%, then that would be another story, because that would also bring us back to the question of whether or not we should support it. And second is about where the line should be drawn. So we are listening to that. And we are talking to the stakeholders and concerned groups, and from what we have heard from them, well, some said that you should relax it to 75%, and for certain households, you might be relaxing it to 80% or 100%. So that would also be considered in this review. Next, Mr. Kwok Wai-kung. First of all, on LIFA, I'd like to see if we can arrange for a public hearing to be held, because we'd like to listen from these families. So whether or not they have applied for LIFA, we'd still like to hear from them. So what's their situation like now? So I hope that a public hearing can be held as soon as possible. The best if we can hold it before July. And also, as many members have said, you initially expected some 700,000 people to benefit, and now you have only about 100,000. All right, if we do not have low-income families, then of course we can understand it. But obviously that's not the case. Well, Gini coefficient has exceeded a certain level. It is at record high, and yet we do not have enough people coming forward to apply for that allowance. Why is it the case? We haven't heard from the administration as to why we have this phenomenon, why it has not achieved the desired effect. All right, you said that you hadn't done the review and therefore you did not have the answer. I don't think that's not acceptable, because you should have collected some basic information and you should have exercised your judgment to assess the effectiveness of the scheme, and yet you haven't done it. That's disappointing. Okay, if they were to get the full allowance of $1,000, then they will have to work for at least 192 hours a month. In other words, if they are working 8 hours a day, then they would have to work for 6 days a week, and they will have to work for the full 4 weeks a month. So that's quite mean. Why can't you allow people to work for 5 days a week? Even for civil servants, they only have 5-day weeks. So if you multiply that by 8 hours, they should have eligible for the $1,000 full allowance. Why have you drawn the line at such a high level? You should have known it. You should have known that some people are working only 5 days a week, and there is no reason why low-income families should be working 6 days a week. And just now, the SWD colleague said that, all right, they work on Saturdays and Sundays, and therefore, okay, so people have been working from Monday to Saturday, and you're asking people to come to you on weekdays. So you said that, well, you organize such talks or seminars even on Sundays, but how many have you organized on Sundays? And also, if you know that there are many such families, so have you set up booths on the street, and have you organized open days, or even form filling days, so that you can tell them that, okay, so we'll be focusing on filling the forms for you, so you can come on a particular day and then we can help you. So have you done such things? Or is it like what you said, you would just be deploying staff to go down to the centers to help them just quietly, and then for the forms that you've collected, well, this year, in the first 6 months, you're only collecting some 380 such forms. So what kind of improvement is that? Some colleagues were also concerned that your review, when can you have the findings? Because when we go after the administration for certain things, we always understand that it's a headache. Because for paternity leave, you said that you would be doing a review in a year's time, and yet it's been 2 years, and still you haven't got the answer. And then for this LIFA, you said that you would be getting the answers by the end of the year. So will you be able to come back by the end of the year? Chairman, what I'd like to say is, well, on data collection, we didn't start in the middle of this year. In fact, we started earlier, because we knew that when you conducted such questionnaire survey, you would have to start early. So we started early this year. And then for the questionnaire itself, that would be completed in around July this year, and then we would have the data to help us with the review. And then we said that by the end of this year, we should be able to come back with some recommendations. And then for the remaining question, is about the WFAO, whether or not they have held talks. They have held talks on Sundays. I'll defer to the SWD. Well, if members remember, well, in November 2015, we announced that we would be introducing this scheme in May 2015. In other words, starting from December 2015, we already started the first round of our briefing sessions, so that welfare organizations and NGOs have been briefed on the details of the scheme. Subsequently, well, in between November 2015 to March 2016, we organized 34 briefing sessions. Some of them were organized for ethnic minority groups. Sorry, the question was on the seminars or briefing sessions are held on Sundays. Other than that, those are held at Lot 4. And then in April 2016, because we already had the application forms, that's why, in fact, in different districts, after some 225 briefing sessions were held, all of them were held during weekends because we knew that, on Saturdays and Sundays, that might be more convenient for members of the public to attend. And also from April of 2016 to September that year, we went to different government organizations. We also responded to some NGOs' requests. In fact, in between September 2016 and June 2017, some 476 support sessions have been held. So that's on their request, and we have done that too. And also earlier on, some NGOs told us that in fact there is a group of people who might have difficulties in filling out the forms. That's why we have entrusted some NGOs to provide some form filling services to them, and that's what we have done. And since January this year, we've been doing that, and some 4 NGOs were asked to do the job from January to May, and 380 plus application forms were received during that period of time. So we've been thinking about how we can publicize it, how we can help the public to apply. And one of the things that would be more pragmatic, that is, if some people do have this need for help, then they are welcome to call us by our hotline, and then they can give us some information, and then according to the information that they give us, then we will see what we can do to help them. Thank you. Chairman, what I'd like to know is, well, in fact, specifically, when you ask them, they will be telling you very much the same thing. So what I'd like to say is, well, for the low-income families in Hong Kong, definitely there are more than 30,000 such households and more than 100,000 such people. So please do work harder in order to help them. Yes, without outreaching programs, we would definitely be asking you to do more. But then after the outreaching programs, you only managed to get 380 more applications. That's a problem. How come you've been organizing so many briefing sessions, you only managed to get some 380 plus applications? Chairman, as the Bureau has explained, we have to identify where the problems are. But then we have already done this outreach, and we've been telling the NGOs from time to time that do you know friends who might need our help, so that we can send people to do this briefing to them for them, and then we can also provide support for them. So honestly, we've been asking them time and again, and to a certain point, we still haven't been able to identify these people. And that's why we've been thinking hard about this. Which channels should we resort to in order to publicize this scheme? And as I said in response to a member's question, we noticed that at Lot 4, well, at the PRH Application Center is actually a very good venue for us to provide the service. That's why every single day we send our staff to that center to set up a counter to help people. If they have any questions in filling out the form, then we will help them to fill out the forms. Not every department would have this kind of service, but then we will still maintain that at different time slots, we would send our staff to different departments so that we can set up a counter at their lobbies, and then we can help and reach out to these potential applicants. But then in the end, as to whether or not you can get the allowance, whether or not you're able to meet the wage requirement and also the working hours requirement, that's another story. Okay, we have 4 motions that we have to deal with. We have Kok Wai Keung, Lau Siu Lai, Michael Tian. They have respectively submitted their own motions. Yes, Fernando Cheung. Chairman LIFA was originally intended to help the working poor so that they would not be living in poverty. And initially, you plan to help some 200,000 families, and yet in the end only some 30,000 families managed to get it. So after a year's implementation, I can also declare that it is a total failure.
Without removing the absence limit, I think the number will even be lower. I can see that when you have abolished the absence rule, you are quite flexible, and it's been a year. Your goal has not been reached. The consequence is that a lot of poor working families are still waiting for urgent assistance. Well, one of the target groups is children and youths. If they live in a poor working family, they should not be penalized because their family members don't work the required hours. Children in poor families should receive assistance. I do think that you need to review this further. So when it comes to the stringent requirements of number of working hours, the complicated application procedures, they all have to be reviewed. And the most important thing is that it has to be swift. I heard from the DS that improvement measures will be put in place at the end of the year. People are unhappy. Some people are living in difficulties. And I'm also concerned about ethnic minorities. Well, the report of the Poverty of Commission, the Commission of Poverty said that for some Nepalese families, they have a very appalling poverty rate. For Pakistani families, is particularly serious. So amongst the 30,000 families, how many of them are ethnic minority families? Could you expedite your review so that the first thing to be completed within the first quarter of the new government, it will be done? We'll do it as soon as possible. But it's a complicated issue. We talk about requirements of working hours and wages, but there are different factors. Say, for example, whether if they are carers or family members, there should be a lower number of work hours requirements. And some people say that certain incomes should be disregarded. This is a complicated issue. We will try to be as quick as possible. If you require us to complete it before the end of the year, it may be very difficult. Well, if a partial review will be quicker, then we will ask for a partial review. But if it is partial, then there will be other problems. So it's not recommended. Ethnic minorities, I would defer to the head. As at the 2nd of June, there are 870 ethnic minority families whose application have been approved. With 1,357 families and $1.7 million. No, 870 ethnic minorities families that have received LIFA. Some of them, they have received it more than once, so 1,357 times. So is that a breakdown? Say, for example, Pakistani families, Nepalese families. Can you give me an information paper afterwards? Yes. 870 out of 32,000 is quite a small number. Are you happy with this number? Agency head. We have not set a target. Still, it's not satisfactory. We deal with the application as soon as possible, once it's received. Well, when it comes to your outreaching efforts, should it be focused more on ethnic minorities? From the moment when application was opened, we have not forgotten about them. And starting from November 2015, we have reached out to different ethnic minority groups through various means. Under the Home Affairs Department, there are 2 ethnic minorities committees. We have reached out to them. We have got to know some leaders of ethnic minority groups. They said that we should visit certain ethnic minority groups before and after their religious ritual, and we have done that. And the first thing we asked them is whether they would need interpretation service. So we have done everything we could. Well, if NGOs who help ethnic minorities would approach us to ask for help, and indeed there are some, we have given their help. Even if they can only identify 4 to 5 families, we're happy to go to them even after office hours. I will extend the meeting by 15 minutes. Next, Mr. Michael Tian. I would like to say this. You chair this meeting. It seems that there is no limit on speaking time. 10 minutes, 8 minutes, 5 minutes, perhaps afterwards. Once you've said that each will have 5 minutes, we will have first round, second round, third round, so that I will get an idea. Otherwise, I'll have to wait forever. I'm not going to say much whether this is effective or not, but I am quite confident. Well, this scheme is to encourage to encourage people to work. This is the spirit of Lion Rock, self-reliance. When that doesn't help, then the government will step in. You have allocated $3 billion. If you want to spend it all, then you will be able to make it happen. Just change the criteria. It's just that you may not find that palatable. And if you want to help 200,000 people, then I can tell you that 3 billion is not enough. You need much more than that. So I would like to ask you, well, what actually would you like to get done? So, $3 billion, you just want to use it all? Then, well, maybe each person will receive more. And when you have improved the scheme, then there may be more than 200. Then there may be more than 200,000 people. Well, there has been criticisms that the application is very difficult. With more form filling services available, I think the situation is better. But some barriers will have to be removed. Otherwise, you won't be able to reach out to 200,000 families to dispense $3 billion. So, this LIFA scheme and also the work incentive transport subsidy scheme, the latter has more flexibility, 6 to 12 months, but it's not the case of the LIFA. And there may be too many different schemes with different criteria and requirements. Since they are all allowances or subsidies, use the same method. It gives the impression that you're trying to make it difficult to deter people. And I hope that, well, this will be relaxed to 6 to 12 months, just like the work incentive transport subsidy scheme. Another thing that's been discussed a number of times in the Poverty Commission. Well, you will only take into account the longest working hour of a member of the family, but when it comes to income, you take into account the income of all family members. So you want to encourage one person to work longer. If you only take into account the working hours of one particular family member, then you only take into account that person's income. Otherwise, you will take into account work hours of all family members. Of course, we encourage family members to work as far as they can. So, why can't you take into account the work hours of all family members? There are two different sets of criteria. I can't answer questions when I'm asked. Another thing, there are many people working casual, doing casual work. Sometimes they may not be able to work 72 hours a month, and in other, they will be able to work 144 or more. So, if there is another option, more than 72 or more than 144, many more people will be interested. Well, a lot of casual workers can attain 72 hours, but not 144. It's useless for them if they can only get several $100s. A lot of people do take up casual work. And the income limit, can it be relaxed to 75% of median income? Currently it's 60%. Well, when you learn the latest Gini coefficient, you do know there is a problem. Well, for those who receive median income of between 60 and 75%, they still encounter financial difficulties. I've selected only some from the numerous problems I have identified, and I have some questions. So, what do you have in mind? 200,000 families or $3 billion? Let me make it clear. We don't have a goal. There is no target. The figures were just estimates. We asked the Census and Statistics Department to work out the number of possible beneficiaries. But of course, you will have to set aside $3 billion and ask the CNSD to give you some estimate. Perhaps I can be given some time. At the outset, we use existing data to work out how many people are eligible. Well, we don't have information about assets. And then, after working out the number of eligible families, then we'll work out the amount required. There are two levels. For those currently eligible, why don't they apply? Another level. For those who are not eligible, say those with slightly higher income or slightly lower working hours, they should receive our subsidy. The member asked for relaxation of income limit and also the number of working hours. We'll take that into account because it's also the request of a lot of organizations. Well, what about income at casual basis? Well, the original design was to make it as simple as possible. Well, if you ask two people to furnish information about work hours, it will be more complicated. But we have heard requests. saying that if income covers the entire family, then work hours should be too. And there's also 6 to 12 months. We'll take that into account.
Okay, Ms. Lau Siu Lei, and then we'll deal with the 4 motions. Also, Mr. Leung. Well, thank you, Chairman. I've always supported the views of Mr. Michael Tian. That's why I'm trying to supplement on other areas. But then you do have to understand this, Chairman. This is a very complicated issue, and if you just look at your own remarks, that has exceeded 5 minutes, and together with the officials' response, it took up some 7 minutes. So I'll be very brief in my comments because I suspect that the officials would just be telling us very much the same thing. And if you look at the latest Gini coefficient, 0.539, so Hong Kong's wealth gap is widening. So there are many people in the lower income bracket. And if you look at those who are eligible, in fact, they are super poor. So you should be getting some 75% of the median income. That would be more reasonable. And also for the cashier wage or cashier workers, it's not that they don't want to work up to the working hours limit, but then it's the employers who are trying to make their jobs casual. That's why not many workers are eligible. That's because of the nature of the jobs. And also, if you look at these families, they are very complicated in their so it's not that they are not trying to work, but then many people have to take care of their family members. That's why they are not able to work that long. And they are, of course, they cannot afford to hire foreign domestic helpers. So even if that's reduced by half to 72 hours, that's not unreasonable. The reason why we have the working poor, I think, is a disgrace in itself because the wages are so low. And for the grassroots, they're actually subject to a lot of problems, and they are not able to get a reasonable standard of living. That's why you will have to lower the working hours limit. And also for children, are we trying to make sure that intergenerational poverty will not continue? Well, whether it's the problem of the parents or whether or not they have not worked long enough and whether they are not able to meet certain criteria, it has nothing to do with the children. And therefore for the children's allowance, so long as they can meet the requirement, they should be able to get the full allowance, and that should not be pegged to the working hours. So I hope that this issue can be dealt with separately. And also at the Welfare Services Panel, we have already discussed this. Do we have 1P families allowance? Because there are some singletons in the society who have not been assisted by the administration at all. And I think this is a vicious circle, because if you do not give them support, then their situation would only get worse. And therefore, I hope that LIFA can be extended to 1P family so that they can also benefit. And then for the asset limit, that should be the same as 2P families. Only then will you be able to help them. And anyway, you have the money available, and therefore, I hope that you can consider lowering these criteria so that more families can benefit. Yes, Mr. Leung Kwok-hong. Chairman, I think I've said this many times already, whether it's the LIFA or the Work Incentive Transport Subsidy Scheme. I think the problem is you're not really dealing with the problem itself. So you have a headache, and yet you're giving them food medication. So for the disadvantaged workers, they have told you that it's not that we don't want to go out to work, but then transportation cost has been so high. So at that time, it was still Matthew Cheung who was the Labour and Welfare Secretary, and now he's the Chief Secretary for Administration. What Mr. Cheung is notorious for doing is that, for anything that can be dealt with by some patchy measures, then he'll be prepared to do it. So for the transport subsidy scheme, we went back and forth for 4 times. So you're actually treating headache with food medication. You're not applying or administering the right medication. So I think it all boils down to the fact that the wages have been too low, and they are not getting any overtime pay at all, because workers' rights are not protected. So even if you work for 72 hours, they would not treat you as a proper worker. So we will require the employer to do something about it. So for the employers, they would just say that you will have to take care of yourselves, or we will have to take out something from the profits tax revenue so that we can do something about it. And if you continue to adopt this patchy approach, then who will suffer? We are talking about the most disadvantaged group, the old, the weak, and the disabled. And then for those who are unskilled, they simply have no bargaining chip. Well, earlier on, I went to the court, and then when I came out, somebody talked to me that he would support me, and then I asked him, what are you doing? Well, he's a security guard, and yet he's still a casual worker. So you've taken the lead in outsourcing all the jobs, and you're trying to make jobs casual jobs. That's the reason. That's the reason why they have not been able to meet your working hours requirement. And the worst is that you're actually penalizing these low-income workers because they are unskilled. That's why they can be dispensed with, and the capitalists do not want to take up the responsibility by hiring them for 18 hours for 4 weeks. So just think about the 418 rule. You multiply the 4 with 18, and then you will come up with 72. So I don't really want to argue with you about this. How should I put it? Alright, for a very poor guy, when he asks you for food, and if you just give him a large bunch of bones, and you tell them that, well, there's some meat in there, and you can just try to eat it. Okay, so he takes home a big bag of bones. Well, it's very heavy, so he would be hard-pressed, and he won't be able to eat it at all. My suggestion is along the lines of what Ms. Lau has suggested. Alright, you talk about Hong Kong's future. There is no reason why a child does not have a choice. So, when it comes to a poor family, and yet he'll be losing before he even gets started. So you have to really help the poor, or the poor children in these families, and also for the disabled and also the old. Alright, they are working for nothing. They are not paid, so you will have to help them. So, Chairman, I don't really have much to say. I think that's because these policies have come from different departments. Alright, just think about the work incentive transport subsidy scheme. We have discussed that for 3 or 4 years. So we are just looking at where we can find the meat in the bone. So we've been discussing with you. Well, can you give them fewer bones and then give them more meat? So it's just an argument like that. So they have all been called subsidies and so on. All right. So well, can we extend the meeting by another 5 minutes so that we can deal with all the motions, and then we can conclude today's meeting? Okay, 4 motions. First from Michael Tin, second from Kwok Wai Keung, and the third and fourth from Lau Siu Lai. So, Mr. Michael Tin, can you read out your motion first? Thank you, Chairman. In view of the fact that the LIFE program has not been very effective, as at June 2017, only 110,000 people have benefited, which is a far cry from the 200,000 originally expected. It has not been able to achieve its desired effect. So this council asked the administration to extend the application period from 6 to 12 months. Second, we should allow the families' working hours to be added together. And third, we should also introduce a new working hours limit from 72 hours to 144 hours, and also for those, and we should also set the income limit at 75% or below of the median wage. Dr. Fernando Cheung, well, instead of 200,000, it should be 700,000. So 200,000 families. So we should modify the number. So it should have been 700,000 beneficiaries, 700,000 people benefiting from it. Okay, so just change the figure. Okay, so shall we put it to the vote? Well, for those in favor, please raise your hands. All right, unanimously agreed. Second, Mr. Kwok Wai Keung. Since the introduction of LIFE in May last year, the effect has been a far cry from the original policy intention, and many families have not joined the scheme. We urge the administration to review it so that you can relax the rules, including the income limit and also the working hours limit. The procedures should also be simplified in order to help the working poor. Will those in favor please raise their hands? Okay, unanimously agreed. Okay, so the motion is carried. Third, Lau Siu-lai. This panel urges that for the LIFER scheme, we should introduce the one family category, and the income limit should also be pegged to those for 2P families. Will those in favor please raise their hands? Okay, motion is carried. The fourth one, Lau Siu-lai. This panel urges that for the children allowance under the LIFER, it should be unpacked from the working hours restriction so that all eligible low-income children would be eligible for the children's subsidy. Will those in favor please raise their hands? Thank you. Motion is carried. Okay. Any other business? If not, then I declare that the meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, officials, for coming. Thank you.